Data and statistics are the backbone of the choices governments make, the services citizens receive, and the policies that shape our economies. In this new Paris 21 podcast, Johannes Jütting, development economist and head of Paris 21, speaks with an expert to explore how the fundamental principles of official statistics play out in real life. I'm Rodrigo Ortiz, guiding the conversation from behind the controls. Welcome to Trusting the Numbers, from Principles to Agency.
Welcome back to another episode of the Paris 21 podcast, Trusting the Numbers, from Principles to Agency.
I'm so delighted to have two esteemed colleagues with me today on the show. We have Stefaan Verhulst, who is professor at University of New York, and we have Roeland Beerten, who is the chief statistician of the National Bank of Belgium. Welcome to the show, Stefaan.
Thanks for having me, Johannes.
And welcome, Roeland.
Thanks for having me as well. Great to be here.
I wanted to start with a conversational question. Can you remember a recent moment where data or a number changed something important for you? Maybe we start, Stefaan. Can I put you on the spot?
Thanks for that easy question, Johannes. I would argue that a lot of the work that I have done is things have changed because data was not available. And so I might actually turn the question upside down, Johannes, and say, what did change because there was a lack of data? And so one of the areas that I'm working on, and I recently published a blog about with a colleague of mine, Daniela Paolotti, was the fact that we are, again, in an environment where we have two major events. On the one hand, we have the Hanta virus that, of course, everyone was made aware of as a result of the outbreak in a cruise ship. And now, of course, there's not a single day where we have a front page news about the Ebola outbreak in Congo and neighboring countries. And so what is the travesty from my perspective is that despite the fact that we were all locked up for 2 years and that Johannes and Roeland and myself were on calls nonstop arguing for more data because data turned out to be a life and death kind of conversation as it relates to a pandemic, despite the fact that we've had that kind of massive experience and a massive value proposition for having access to data, we still have not made any progress on actually having access to data, especially non-traditional data. And we see this also, again, in the context of those new events where access to data is limited, and that also has led to kind of a very slow response to those two recent outbreaks, which also has meant that many people basically have lost their lives as a result of not having access to data. And so it is not just a nice thing to have a conversation about. Data does make a difference in people's lives, especially at a time when there is a public health outbreak. And so I'm sorry, Johannes, to start with a kind of depressing answer, but I would say, from my perspective, having no access to data has made more impact quite often.
Very clever answer from the university professor. I really appreciate this. I know this also relates to your recent work on data winter, which we will hopefully discuss also. But Roeland, is there anything where a data point changed something in your life?
Well, interestingly enough, before Stefaan kicked off, I already was thinking, actually, I also have more examples of situations where data were not available as well. So Stefaan can accuse me now of stealing his ideas. We know at the moment, a lot of front page news is around the war in Iran and the effect it has on energy and on petrol usage. And so a few weeks ago, one of the kind of policymakers here in the country sent me an email with a question saying, oh, do we have real-time information on petrol consumption of households in Belgium? And I think it's quite a good example of a question that, of course, from a policy perspective is very relevant, but it's quite a stretch, I think, for most statistical organizations to provide real-time data, right? That's something we try to improve on in terms of timeliness, but real-time data, that's quite a high or quite a tall order. And so my thinking there was, okay, we are in a bit of an energy crisis right now. But then if you think back a few years, when we had the war breaking out in Ukraine, afterwards there was also an energy crisis. And so one of the questions I actually posed at a workshop a few weeks ago was actually, have we learned something as a statistical community in terms of providing data on these kind of big geopolitical events? Have we learned something from the previous energy crisis in terms of data availability? Because if we did, then maybe it would help us now to have some quicker data or to have some better data on what's happening right now in a very similar situation. So, and I think sometimes in the world of official statistics, we're doing great work on innovation and so on, but sometimes maybe we're like a little bit, or maybe not enough self-critical in terms of, do we learn from experiences in the past in terms of improving data access and data availability?
To situate our conversation in the context of these fundamental principles of official statistics, which to some extent is a little bit the bedrock of this podcast as well, and where we want to talk about different elements of those principles. I looked it up again and I found out that the principles have been endorsed by the Statistical Commission in 1994 and by the UN General Assembly in 2014. So more than 10 years ago. And from what we were discussing so far, it seems that many things have changed in terms of the demand from users. And you both seem to relate to very concrete events that happen now in the world where it would be good to have official statistics and data, but they are simply not there, or maybe not accessible, or maybe not in the form that we would like to see it as an ordinary consumer. So this brings me a little bit to the question of our first topic, which I would like to unpack a little bit, is about trust, the current situation of a polarized world, and what does that mean for official statistics? How can official statistics remain relevant and timely, which is to some extent linked to both examples that you were providing. So in terms of a point that we discussed when we prepared for this was neutrality. Should and can statistical offices remain neutral in today's polarized world? Stefan.
Thanks, Johannes. And I was hoping that you would start with Roeland this time, so I would have 5 minutes to think about this. Well, first of all, I think it is a bit of a leap to Johannes, and this might be, again, I might be blamed to be the academic on the call here, but it's a bit of a leap to make a connection between trust and neutrality as being the same context, all right? And of course, the question is, does neutrality contribute to trust, or are other variables equally important and should be emphasized? And I would argue, Johannes, if you look back at the fundamental principles behind official statistics, I think they are very solid and probably should remain and actually have become more important. What I would also argue is that there is one principle missing in the fundamental principles, and that's the principle of participation. And then I will come back to neutrality eventually, Johannes, because from my perspective, trust you don't obtain by achieving legitimacy by mandate, which is typically how official statistics have been operating, is that they got a mandate to provide official statistics. And of course, you have the fundamental principles, and then you have kind of a certain level of going about producing statistics that emphasize rigor, emphasize a certain level of quality. But that turns out not to be sufficient in today's world, where there is a growing expectation that, exactly as Roeland was also referring to, that the questions that people have are also the questions that statistical agencies are sensitive to. And more importantly, that the answers that statistical agencies produce are answers that correspond to lived experience of citizens and residents as well. And it turns out that more and more, I would argue, citizens feel that the questions that official statistics are providing, despite the fact that they provide a fundamental baseline, ground truth, and so on, are quite often not fully aligned with the questions that citizens have. And there are also a certain sense that numbers that are being provided by official statistics are not corresponding with kind of how citizens feel about real experiences. And that goes back to kind of our joint article, of course, is that typically official statistics produce averages. But if you ask any citizen, do you feel yourself to be an average? I don't think many would agree with that. From my perspective, it's not just about neutrality, it's also about responsiveness and about participation that actually will provide this level of trust. And that will become more important as official statistics are more and more under threat. And the threat is not per se a threat because they are neutral. The threat is because they might not be as responsive as one would hope vis-a-vis real needs in terms of information needs and real needs in terms of actually making sure that official statistics capture lived experience in addition to, of course, a ground truth that is based upon quantitative descriptive analysis. And again, we can unpack what neutrality means, but I think neutrality cannot mean being insensitive to what people actually need to know. And I think that's kind of quite often confused.
Roland, can I be a bit provocative here? I mean, I take you now as a representative of the global statistical community. You are quite engaged in many fora, and of course, Stefaan has a perspective from the academic and brings in very important societal questions. But the question is on this neutrality defined by whom? If I understand Stefaan correctly, I mean, neutrality shouldn't be the only principle. Who defines what is neutral? So if I look in our community, to be very honest, we are seen by many people as the experts, as sitting somewhere in an ivory tower, having a lot of technical knowledge. The question is, if I understand Stefaan correctly, I mean, you would need, as a statistical community, to do much more to bring in other partners. So do we need an influencer on the Belgium board of directors? A person that can speak to TikTok that brings in a very different perspective, maybe, to remain neutral or to become neutral? Or how do you relate to this?
It's a very interesting discussion, right? So, I mean, your first question was around neutrality. And as Stefaan already indicated, we can unpack this a bit further. What does neutrality mean? I think within the world of official statistics, what we strive for and what we should strive for is impartiality, which is a slightly different concept from neutrality. And one of the reasons why I'm saying that is that if you think about it, of course, in official statistics, we are the experts in measuring things, right? But before you measure something and before you start collecting the data on something, you should define it. So a big part of the job of official statisticians is defining the concepts and defining what you actually want to measure and get data on to then produce statistics on. Now, I don't think in itself the definitions that we choose in the international official statistical community, I don't think you can call them neutral. I think behind every definition, there's a choice. There's some kind of judgment behind every definition about how you should look at the world. And I have been in situations on certain indicators where you will quite easily get into arguments about, yeah, you've measured it like this, but you could also measure it like that. And then you get like a different outcome, right? And so I think that whole concept of neutrality is an interesting one. I think to the defense of the world of official statistics internationally as well, and this goes back to the fundamental principles as well, is that, of course, the reasons why internationally we try to agree on one definition of a certain concept is to be able to make international comparisons. Because if you need to compare things between countries, you need to use the same definition and the same way of measuring things. And so from an international perspective, the kind of uniformity in definitions is important. But I think we should also not forget that the definitions we then use are not necessarily neutral, and there are possibilities of measuring things in a different way. And I think this is where the conversation with Stefaan picks up quite nicely around what is then the role of official statistics in terms of providing information for the public good. And again, it's a term we talk about a lot in official statistics. We work for the public good, but who do we mean by the public, right? And I think that's where Stefan's point around citizens and around the lived experiences. Stefaan said we have been writing on this together. That's where this is quite a relevant point of discussion, I think, because, okay, the public good, it does refer to citizens and not just the experts that we need to disseminate statistics to. I think the statistics that we publish should have relevance for citizens as well. And in order to do that, we probably need to start different models of involvement and engagement with different groups than the ones that we've been used to in terms of engaging with. And that kind of goes back to the first thing that Stefaan talked about just now, is around this whole concept of trust and trustworthiness of our statistics and our data. I very much agree with him. I think in the last few decades, trust was very much based on the fact that the data and the numbers came from an institution like the National Statistical Office or the central bank and so on. And so people trusted the number because it came from higher up, from an institution higher up. And in a way, that's what I would call the kind of vertical trust. But I think we are now in a situation where building horizontal trust is actually becoming more and more important. And what I mean by horizontal trust is exactly what Stefaan was referring to, is to ask the questions around who do we engage with, to define the questions, to define the concepts, to make sure that the data are actually reflecting people's daily lives, people's lived experience, and so on. People at the UK Statistics Authority, they've been talking quite a lot about this difference between horizontal and vertical trust and how the nature of trust is actually changing in today's world. And I think it's important for us as an official statistics community to at least spend some time on reflecting what does it mean for us, because we've always been in a situation where we as institutions have always relied on this vertical trust model. But now the horizontal trust model is becoming more prominent. And what does it mean for the way that we engage with users in the very broad sense, including citizens?
Very interesting. Just building on this conversation right now in terms of the role and the trust of official statistics and the National Statistical Office, when we had the COVID crisis in the German TV, every other day we had a new expert. They were all professors from very distinguished universities. They were all people who could eloquently speak. The problem at the end of the day was that from an ordinary layman, what they were telling us were at times not at all in sync. I had the feeling that after these 2 years or so or longer on the COVID crisis, the expert lost in its sort of appreciation by society. And if then the expert speaks in a TV show with an influencer who's eventually much smarter, can express himself clearly, or uses other language, people trusted instinctively more that influencer, although that person had no clue whatsoever on the thing. Now, do you think that, for instance, now if a statistical office, Roeland, or the Bank of Belgium or whatnot, observes in key debates of society, be it immigration, and there are numbers sort of promoted by key senior figures, either of government, of society, has the National Statistical Office not an obligation to intervene at some point? I give you one example, which is by now outdated. It's the famous number of Boris Johnson when he was campaigning for the Brexit. I don't know the exact amount what he came up with of how much money the UK would win. And this was completely absurd, and reality told him completely wrong. But people used that number everywhere in the debate, and it made a huge impress. And we have this also in other debates. What should the statistical office do in those cases?
It's interesting you raised the example of the Boris Johnson bus in the UK at the time of Brexit, because I lived there and I worked in the UK at that time. And of course, I mean, what happened was someone like a politician puts out that number, which is completely not correct. And actually at the time, there was like criticisms from the UK Statistics Authority on that number. But of course, what you get in those kinds of situations, the countering of the number arrives a day or 24 hours later. And in the current quick media cycle, the actual original wrong number gets spread like wildfire. And the rebuffing of it just comes like too late, and no one talks about it anymore. So everybody still talks about the wrong number. And so I think, on the one hand, yes, I do think as official statistics institutes, we do have an obligation or a duty to counter fake news, to counter fake numbers, but we should be smarter in the way of getting about it. And going back to your COVID data example, one of the people I've worked with in the UK, a great guy, is David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge University. He has written a whole book on the COVID data and how we as a statistics community have handled the whole COVID data episode. And he has been quite critical, not just of us as a community, but also, of course, of the wider society and the media. For instance, he was talking about the number theater. Numbers were plentiful and they were everywhere, but very often they were numbers without context. They were numbers without explanations about the limitations of those numbers. There were problems around uncertainty and around, for instance, the risk rates that were presented. He raises it, the risk rates were just presented as average risk rates, and we didn't do enough, or we didn't make enough efforts to break them down by sex or by age and so on, which would have been much more relevant to actual people looking at the numbers. I'm a male who's like 54 years. This is my risk, right? Rather than just giving the average for the whole population. And so I think, yeah, I mean, the whole issue of numbers in the public debate, it has become very difficult. It has become more difficult, of course, with all the digital media. But I still think we have a duty to intervene in the public debate and actually also be honest about where the limitations of the numbers are. I think we don't do this enough. And for me, this is also a key part of actually having trust and having trustworthy data, is to be able to say, okay, we have numbers here, but there's some uncertainty around it. They're not the true number, but it is the best number that we can give you based on the best available information that we have. And that's a message that I don't think we spread enough in the statistics that we publish. Statistics, by definition, are estimates. They are not like the truth per se. There's uncertainty about it. And in order to have trust in those numbers, you need to be very transparent about this, about the uncertainty that surrounds it and the fact that it's just an estimate.
This brings me to the point of strengthening data literacy or the ability of people to relate to numbers. And now, Stefaan, with the advent of AI, I was just listening to an interesting podcast on AI and creativity. And the point that was made was that AI liberates knowledge and allows us who have been maybe sort of away from doing certain things, not able to do it, not being able to go to a certain school or teaching. It will not be as maybe good as the person who has done all the training, but it could be reasonably good. So can we not all become as chief statisticians like Roeland in our own lives in some way?
Thanks, Johannes. I presume the way you formulated, Johannes, is a bit provocative. So you expect me to just agree with you and say, yes, Johannes, and that's it. Next question. But obviously, I think AI has both a positive component. And as you mentioned, it actually does democratize access to data. It also democratize notions of creativity. At the same time, my fear is that it also will mean that we are becoming far more dependent on AI without actually taking the time to reflect on what is the question, what's the intent of our information-seeking behavior to a large extent. And so what we have seen, and I've written about that as well, I call this the kind of the end of the tabula rasa phenomenon. So in the past, quite often, many people could not reflect on how do I go beyond the blank page, because you actually did need to have a certain set of skills to know how do I fill the blank page in a way that is meaningful. Now, any generative AI tool will skip the blank page and give you the answer, or give at least with a very simple formulated prompt, will give you something. So the tabula rasa basically gets skipped. At the same time, my fear is that because the cost of providing answers or the cost of providing imagery has gone down. What has become more important is actually the question that initiates the answer, the question that initiates the response. And so we see kind of a shift. And by the way, we see this also within the scientific community, where in the past, most of the time was spent on actually creating an answer, was spent on gathering information, making sure that we had all the information. That cost and the time spent on that has radically decreased. But has the answer improved and has the quality of the answer improved? Probably not. And that's because we don't spend enough time on actually formulating the question that matters. Yes, we need data literacy, but in today's world, I would argue one of the most important skills, really knowing what is the question that will make a difference, because you can get any answer that you want depending on the question. There's this whole field of cognitive economics now that is actually spending a lot of time on what they call diagnostic uncertainty, which is, yes, now we have a question to start with. More importantly will become, what's then the question once you have an answer? To then update the answer that has been provided in almost real time. And so it's ultimately questions fluency. It's knowing how to architect the inquiry, how to architect the quest that is becoming far more important. And surprise, surprise, Johannes, I've done some work on trying to understand what is out there in terms of questions fluency. Where can people go to become more questions fluent? It's very limited. We've spent a lot of time on data science, yet we have no question science. And so we see a fundamental gap, from my perspective, in the fluency and the literacy, which is questions fluency, which is why it's so easy to become bombarded with answers, why it's also so easy to have influencers basically spewing out answers, because no one really reflects on, well, is this an answer that I actually care about? Because this is my question. And so that's kind of the situation that we are in. And my fear is that unless we spend a lot more time on questions fluency, and this is not just formulating better prompts, it's also knowing about what is the problem that I'm seeking or the problem that I'm trying to get a better understanding. What is it that I already know? Because in order to be able to formulate good questions, you actually need to know what is your level of ignorance with regard to a particular topic. And again, AI makes you an expert immediately without actually a better understanding of what's the kind of ignorance level on a certain topic and the ignorance level as relates to your own kind of knowledge frame. And so that would be my answer, Johannes, is that yes, a lot of democratization, but the democratization has mainly been focused on solutions, on answers, without actually taking into account that it becomes far more important to actually spend on being able to formulate a question that matters, and then the next question that will actually fine-tune and get you to a better result as well. That's what I fear, is that we will become more bombarded with answers. And we see this already in the science environment. The level of papers that is being produced is massive, but does it actually contribute to any new wisdom? Does it contribute to actually insights that really makes a difference? And that's because we don't reflect on the question. And it goes back to what Roeland was referring to as well during COVID. One of the big questions that I learned during COVID was that no one really knew what are the questions that matter to respond to an effort like COVID. We all started spewing data and spewing information. But if you would take a step back and say, okay, these are the kind of the key elements, location, people, how do they go about engaging with others? If you would say these are the top 10 questions, then you would actually be able to formulate a really intensive information ecosystem around those core questions. But we typically jump to the answer. And this is important at the individual level. This becomes even more important at the decision level. And so quite often when I meet decision makers who are all convinced that anyway, evidence-based policymaking is important, if I ask them, well, can you tell me the 5 questions that will make your mission far more successful? Most people have no idea what are the questions that actually will make a difference in how they go about solving a problem. And so we really have a problem, not on the data science perspective, but on the question science.
Really very interesting, Roland. If we bring this conversation more now to our data and official statistics community, and of course, AI is in every conference. My question to you is, in this context, how do you see specifically the relation to the private sector companies and who is in charge? Because many of these companies are now starting to reach out to official statistical office. There are some attempts to work together. Maybe also on data ethics, what is ethically possible and what not. Where do we stand in this conversation? Because I again see in our community lots of conversation about data AI readiness. Can these things be found by the machines? Fine, but these more complicated, even business questions from an ethical as well as from a purely business perspective, is that reflected upon? What do you think?
Okay, I think there's about 10 questions in that one question. But yeah, I'll try to unpick some of it. I mean, first of all, just to hook on to what Stefaan was saying around data literacy and question literacy, I've had very similar feelings for the last 10, 15 years or so, because I'm a classically trained official statistician and I used to work in survey design and surveys, and that's how we collected the data and the information. And actually, that's a good example of question-driven information collection, right? So first you're thinking about what questions do we actually put in the questionnaire to collect data on. So that's a clear example of question-driven data. Now, of course, what we've seen over the last few decades is, okay, the history of statistics, it started with censuses, with surveys. Then we had the whole development of databases within government, administrative databases, where already the questions were not really that clearly inside the databases. There was lots of data on people, on various aspects of people's lives and their financial situation, their social situation, and so on, but much less so question-driven than the surveys and the census before. And then 15 years ago, or even longer ago, all of a sudden everybody started talking about big data, of course, with like the digitalization move. Plenty of data to be found everywhere. Everybody is dripping with data. And so we're going to use all these data to get information from. And I think this is where the point that Stefaan makes is very valid. I think in the official statistics community, we kind of struggle with that new model because I think we're still very much in the mindset of what's the question? And we are used to defining questions first and then find the data for it. And of course, now you get policymakers who go, oh yeah, but you must have the answer because the data must be somewhere. But they don't know what the answer to is. And so I think it's an interesting evolution. The whole private sector data, of course, hooks into that as well. I mean, basically, yes. I mean, private companies do have data. But again, the question there is what question do you want to get answered with those data? So I think Stefaan's point around question literacy is a very important one. I think it's not because we have much more data now that we necessarily have better information to base decisions on, as long as the people who make the decisions don't formulate the questions first. On AI, yes, there's lots of debate in the official statistics community around AI and the use of AI, of course. Quite a lot of discussion at the moment around, okay, how do these AI agents, how do they find the official data? If you put in a prompt around what is the GDP of France, does ChatGPT or Claude or any other tool, does it give the official answer? And tests have shown, no, it doesn't. It finds the information elsewhere, and it may or may not be true. And so at the moment, we have lots of discussions in our community around how can we make sure that our official data can be found first by those agents to make sure they pop up first as the official statistic in those answers. My slight worry is we are very focused on the mechanics of this right now. How do we technically make this work to actually get our data into those machines? I think we should have a bit more discussion around the quality of the data and how can we make sure that the data or the information that we give with our data makes clear that it is high quality data. That's not always clear. The other big issue, you mentioned this in the beginning, Johannes, and I'm going to let Stefaan talk about this more because it is his concept, but I don't think we worry enough about data quality in the context of AI and the availability of data. And you mentioned earlier the whole concept of data winter, which comes from Stefaan. But I think in terms of AI and the concept of official statistics, yes, it is important. We are engaging with it, but it's not quite always clear where we're going right now. But I think that's the same for many sectors of society and industry, including private companies. The one thing I am thinking about quite a lot is what does it mean for skills in an organization like a stats office? Because like already we see some fairly recent new employees in the bank here. They enter the bank and they work on statistical, economical questions. But without even asking or without even thinking about it, they would have written some code that goes with their thinking. Which is great for us because that means, oh, actually, we don't have to think about employing IT experts who can do the coding. No, young kids these days, they just have a certain mindset whereby they just do the coding there and then, no effort. And so that kind of got me thinking about what does that mean for the new generation, like in the next 10 years when they enter the workplace? They will have brains which are trained by the use of AI. And what does it then mean for the skill set in an organization to have those skills in an organization? Which are the other skills that maybe are lacking? And in any organization, you will still need skills like strategic decision making. You will still need skills around negotiation and communicating with people. That's not going to go away. And you will have still questions around data quality in the context of AI and the kind of critical thinking around the quality of the data that we use as the input for AI. You all know the saying rubbish in, rubbish out. So the whole data quality issue is going to continue to be very important, even though the models may be improving and may be progressing quite strongly.
A couple of weeks ago, there was an interesting article in the Financial Times quoting a study, what kind of skills in companies will be important as a team players. And the point was of that article that already in the past, those people who were a bit more of this kind of positive networking, contributing in a positive way to the global public good in a company were already quite valued. But the argument was made that in this new digital AI-driven skill world, those skills are even more important, and those people will thrive. The argument that people who can relate to others, can listen, can make connections between different projects, and can see the wider picture and communicate, articulate themselves clearly, will have a benefit in terms of making a career. And this brings me a little bit, Stefaan, to the beginning of our conversation. Where do we go from here? We have described a little bit the context of today's world. I think we saw clearly that the fundamental principles may need an update. And the question that we also discuss in our article is this possibility of participation and inclusion. And what stick to me was not seeing citizens as the pure object that you can pinpoint, that you can measure, and then you say thank you very much, but have them engaged. And I wanted to bring this together with a conversation about local data and the question at the local level. What would be ways of going now from this old model of expert knowledge, putting out the data, to some sort of new way of interaction with citizens? And what would be the entry points to make it happen?
There are many opportunities to engage in a more meaningful way with the public. And again, the public broadly defined, because the public, we need to also, by the way, have a better understanding of how do we define the public and what are different types of publics that need to be engaged for different purposes. I would argue that one of the first reasons why official statistics may need to engage with the public, whether it's at the local level or at the national level, is to really regain a social license. And that goes back a little bit to what Roeland was referring to in terms of horizontal trust. Typically, official statistics had a social license, mainly because they were mandated to do whatever they were doing. Now, I would argue that in today's world, that is quite often not sufficient anymore. And it is definitely not sufficient anymore if the official statistics community is expanding its mission. Now they start to seeking access to other data sources than the traditional data sources that official statistics were collecting. That also means that you need to get an additional social license for having access to, for instance, private sector data. I would argue the moment you start touching on AI, you may need a new social license for actually doing that. And so the question then is, of course, how do you get a social license, whether it's at the local level or at the national level? And I think there are kind of three elements that need to be taken into account. First of all, is exactly as Johannes was referring to, we need to innovate in how we engage with communities and how we obtain an understanding of their preferences and expectations as it relates to official statistics. Are they okay that their data was collected through, for instance, in a transactional way because they went to the local supermarket? Are they okay that is being used for official statistics? In addition to preferences, expectations. And that goes back then, Johannes, with regard to expectations of the information that official statistics provide vis-a-vis certain topics that they care about. And so that's kind of the first element, is how do we come up with new, more innovative, but also more trustworthy vehicles for understanding preferences and expectations. And of course, a lot of work has recently been done on citizens' assemblies. During COVID, we actually established here in New York City the first ever citizens' assembly around the reuse of data by government for responding to COVID-19. We call that the data assembly. And so I would argue is that we need to a lot more experimentation in data assemblies, citizens' assemblies around data, which includes, of course, your official statistics, but could include other data reuse cases. The second element in is, of course, how do we then capture that in a way that actually looks like a little bit like a social license? Do we need new kind of licensing regimes that really indicates that this is done in alignment with the social license? Because typically, we quite often declare victory when we had a conversation or we had a town hall meeting, but then how do you capture that in a way that then can be enforced? And I think we need innovation in that space. And then thirdly, we need innovation in how we actually go about enforcement as well. And so that's where we've been working a lot on data commons, which is actually kind of a new institutional vehicles to provide access for reuse cases in alignment with community preferences and expectations. I would argue that it probably needs to be context sensitive as well, because probably in your village, people have perhaps already vehicles to have that conversation. So why create something new? So perhaps you can actually piggyback on existing engagement vehicles. In other cases, you might need to start from scratch, but I think it's all about being able to understand community and people's expectations and preferences that then subsequently can inform how we go about something that provides a social license, which then goes back to your very first question, Johannes, which is how do we obtain trust?
Thanks very much, Roland. A last reflection from your side. I'm realizing we had a wonderful conversation so far. We touched upon many things.
I'm not going to disagree with Stefaan. Obviously, the issue of social license is very important historically, but in the world of official statistics, we are used to working within very strong legal frameworks. And in those legal frameworks, for instance, parliaments can decide that certain data collections will be compulsory for citizens. And for a very long time, we've been thinking, right, we have the legal license to do it, so we're going to do it. But we've never actually asked the question, what about the social acceptability of that? And how does that then relate to the trust in the work that we do, in the numbers that we produce, and so on? So I think it's a very valid question. I think, of course, legal frameworks are important, but in terms of engaging with people, in terms of communicating, in terms of helping them on deciding what questions to ask, this horizontal trust is becoming more important. And so that means the social license of the work that we do is becoming more and more important as well. So yeah, I'm on the same page as Stefaan here.
Great. With this in mind, I would think we can come closely to the end. I give you a chance to share a last reflection on the topic we have discussed today. For me, I have to say, I learned a lot, really very interesting. It seems to me that the official statistical community is a bit at a crossroad. There are some important decisions to be made, and this might be depending also on the specific country context. We haven't really spoken so much about an area we are, as Paris 21, very much engaged. But overall speaking, the role of expert knowledge, data, quality data, from production to use and impact is critical. And also to alert society that we are valuing facts again and evidence, and this is an own value, is something I think for humanity is of super importance. And that's even linked to philosophical question. If we see some of the debates from important politicians these days where obvious facts are called into question, this is really dangerous, I would say. But it's great that we have many examples also where people just do things at the local level. Stefaan or Roeland, any other last comment from your side?
We can have 5 podcasts, I guess, if we would reflect on all the issues that are currently present. And again, it is a very challenging time, I would say, because it's not just about the data winter. I think we also see fears with regard to the weaponization of data. So that's another topic that we need to start thinking about as well. But coming back to what we've been talking about, anyway, how can this also happen at the local level? And so that's where we have been experimenting with what we call Q labs, question labs, where we actually bring people to the table. We don't bombard them or intimidate them with data, but we basically have them reflect on questions that they feel are important. Here in New York, it's all about housing, affordability of housing, or it's about affordability of childcare, or it's about, improvement of transportation. And so just focusing on those, you can actually have a meaningful conversation with citizens and residents. And you can also bring in different stakeholders. We do this quite often with the library system. I apologize, Johannes, for being long-winded. You asked me to have one reflection, and I already gave you multiple.
Roeland, last word by yourself.
One last word is going to be difficult, but I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter than Stefaan, maybe. No, I think, me, from a perspective of the world of official statistics that I'm in, I would like to go back to what we very first started talking about around the fundamental principles of official statistics. Although I've been quite critical in what I've been saying today sometimes of my own world, I still think there's lots of good work being done. There's very strong ethics, there's very strong knowledge about data, but also about questions, as I explained earlier. The world of official statistics is actually very experienced in listening to decision makers and to then help them formulate the question and then to have the data on it. But at the same time, I do think we are in a bit of a rough ride at the moment, given the context where we are around this whole data landscape with lots of data, where everybody talks about data-driven decision-making, which is something I don't like as a term. I think it should be information-driven decision-making, because data shouldn't drive the decisions. It's the questions that should drive the decisions, and the data and the information that you then collect on them. And of course, the other big challenge we talked about already is AI. It's growing very fast. It's hard to keep up with what's happening in that world, and for organizations which are fairly strongly institutionalized, I think it's quite a struggle to sometimes keep up with what's happening. As I said, I think we have very strong points and very strong knowledge and skills. So I'm fairly optimistic about the future. As Stefaan also said, I do think we should maybe change gears on some of the issues around engagement with citizens and making sure that our numbers are relevant to the lived experience of everyday citizens as well.
It's great to end on that high note. So
Thanks for having me, Johannes.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thanks.